When you were in Vietnam, were you always in Vietnam? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah. There was considered a combat zone off the coast of Vietnam of 250 miles. If you were in a ship or part of an attacking aircraft carrier or a destroyer or some other ship that was being used, like they used battleship, they're called the battleships back, they used it for shelling. Battleship will shoot a 14 or 1,500 pound shell 26 miles in the air. If you're in that zone, that's considered a combat zone. I spent some time on the Enterprise. It was the only nuclear aircraft carrier that the Navy had. The standard operation back then was they had 4 carriers active. 3 carriers worked almost around the clock while 1 carrier rested, and then that carrier that had been working would rest, and the other 3 would go. They had planes that they were rearming and refueling 18 hours around the clock. Those kids worked up on that flight that day and night. And it was just constant bombing and ground support from the Marines, the Army, whoever needed it.
You say kids were on the flight deck. What do you mean by that?
Well, aside from the pilots and the aircraft, who were all, you have to be a college graduate to be a pilot. The majority of the kids on those flight decks were anywhere between 17 and 20 years old, and they were taking care of and maintaining and directing aircraft that at the time, one Phantom was like, I think, $14 million, which is nothing by today's standards, by what the planes cost today. Yeah, you had a bunch of basically high school kids
That are responsible for a $15 million piece of equipment.
Yeah.
How much were they paid?
Well, aside from whatever their base pay was, that depended on their rank, the standard fee at the time was you got $55 a month for hazardous duty pay. This is working on a flight deck with jet planes all around you, turning, going, and everybody that was on the ship got $65 a month combat pay. The same thing as the infantry got from land. That was it. And my pay, when I started,
That's what I was about
in
to ask.
basic training, in 1965, my first check was for $78
For a month?
for a month, which is better because my father in World War II got paid $21 a month. That's as the lowest rank there is. Now, the longer you're in and the higher your rank is, the more you get paid.
So you don't go in the military to get rich, huh?
Well, you sure didn't back then. Now it's a little bit better because there's no draft. Everybody's not pulled in the military automatically. Used to be they took a bunch of numbers and they put them in a big bowl, they pulled the name out and they would say, okay, John Smith, it's time for you to go. And you would go down and report to your selective services, and they would tell you when to go get a physical, and you would go off.
So the draft is literally like a lottery, huh?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's the same thing. During Vietnam, usually, it used to be that only the Army drafted, but to get enough people for the war, they would line you up and they would go, you, Army, you, Marine Corps. And usually the Navy never had a problem, or the Air Force didn't get enough people.
You said that sometimes you spend time on the USS Enterprise. How many people were there on the ship at any given time?
A normal combat cruise complement was over 5,000 people. Now, you have what's called ship's company, and that's people that stay with the carrier all the time. But when the air wing is comprised of, normally on an aircraft carrier back then, was 2 attack squadrons of planes, 2 fighter squadrons that fly interceptors, those were Phantoms, 1 squadron of reconnaissance planes, a squadron of rescue helicopters, excuse me, and a squadron of radar extension planes. The ones that, I don't know if you guys have seen them, they have a big disc on top of them. They fly and the big disc turns around on them. But what they use those for, they shoot those planes up, and the radar from the ship hooks up to the radar in that plane, and then that plane radar can read way out in front wherever the pilots are going. And I had a friend of mine that worked in what was called the Combat Information Center. He took me up there one time and showed me these scopes. It's totally dark inside. And he said, "You see that?" And I looked, and I saw this little dot move. It was dot, 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 almost like a video game. I said, "What is that?" He said, "That's a ship moving from one place to another in Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam." They could actually see that, and that was at night. But basically, that was the compliment. The air wing stays on as long as the ship is in combat. When it's not, the air wing flies back to whatever bases it's stationed at in the United States. And then you're left with what's called just a ship's company, and those are the people that take care of the ship itself.
You said it'd be about 5,000.
5,000 total, probably around 3,000 ship's company. People that would stay with it, 2,000 of those were the air wing.
Whenever you were in Vietnam, did you ever see people practicing any religion? And if so, what religions?
Buddhism primarily, and Catholicism, Catholics.
Did you ever get to see any temples or?
Yeah, I have seen them. I didn't spend much time around that because normally we didn't do that kind of sightseeing. We were gone. We were out on missions.
Were servicemen and women able to go to church services while they were overseas?
If you weren't out in the bush, if you weren't out on a mission, you could go. You operated out of what was called a base camp. And that would be like your home area in your neighborhood where you were at. You would leave there and go out wherever you were sent to, and you'd come back here. And they would have chaplains there. And they would either have Protestant services, or they would have Mass for the Catholic services, or they would have Jewish services for the Jewish people.
Hey, did you ever, we talked about the kids in North Korea. A lot of the people are starving there in their communist system. Did you ever see any kids that were hungry or malnourished or starving? And if so, was there anything you could do to help them?
Well, it's a funny story. When I wasn't even in school yet. I had a wooden box that I sat on at the dinner table. And my mother used to try and feed me green beans, and I hated green beans. So I took them when she wasn't looking, I shoved them in the box. Well, that day I got busted. She found out what I did. My father told me, he said, when I was in Italy during World War II, the little Italian kids used to come out and climb on these barges, these garbage barges. When the Navy ships would throw the food that they didn't eat over the side, the mothers and the kids would fight over half-eaten oranges. They would just scoop up whatever food was left over because they were starving.
Trash, literally.
Yeah, and it didn't make any sense to me then. I mean, I was 5 years old. But I can remember one time I was in Hong Kong on R&R, like a temporary vacation. And I saw this little kid running around in what normally would be considered a diaper. It was like a rag wrapped around him. He was probably maybe about 2 years old, and I saw him reach down into a gutter in an open-air market where they were cutting fish up and beef and pork and all that. And there were guts and things laying down in the gutter. And this little kid went over and started to pick them up. So I couldn't speak any Chinese, so I went and I found a Chinese policeman that spoke English. They used to wear a maroon armband on their arm, but they could speak English. So I went over and I asked him if he could help me go over and order some rice. And I got a bunch of little bowls of rice. I gave the lady $20, which back then was a lot of money, but I had plenty of money because I had the way to spend it. And I don't know how many bowls of rice we bought, but I guarantee it was at least as many as all y'all in this room. And those kids were sitting up there just shoving it in. They were so hungry. And they started following me down the street. They thought I was a rich guy with food. And I had to get back to my ship. And so I finally had to go get another policeman and told him what was going on. He kind of chased the kids away. It made me feel bad, but I had to get back to my ship. I couldn't take the kids with me.
But all they wanted was,
But what I remembered when I saw that little kid there, I remember what my dad told me when I was 5 years old. It made no sense to me when I was 5. We take so much for granted in this country, how lucky we are with that much food. You know, if you think you're poor here, you may be poor by American standards, but you're still very rich compared to a lot of other people in other countries.
were there any diseases or medical issues in Vietnam that people struggled with there?
I think most of the medical issues were probably due to parasite infections. A lot of the rice that's planted by hand in the rice paddies over there. Excuse me. You have a lot of parasites in that water. You get a lot of fertilizer and things like that in that water, and it's just it's a breeding ground for disease. That and the kids over there, like you have to have shots here to get into school. The majority of the kids back over there in the middle 60s, they have no shots whatsoever. So we would go into different villages and try to inoculate and help them.
Did you ever have any issues with inoculation? That's vaccinating.
I never did personally, but I know that, and this is a historical fact, that a bunch of group of Green Beret medics went into this one village and they inoculated all these kids. It was part of like a pacification program. They were trying to show that the Vietnamese people that we weren't there to hurt them, we were trying to help them. And they inoculated these kids, and Viet Cong found out about it.
That's North Vietnamese.
Well, actually, they were in South Vietnam. They were just communist sympathizers. They found out about it. They took all the elders in the village and they cut their heads off. They stuck them on bamboo stakes and they put them around the village as a warning. And they killed every one of those kids who had been inoculated and chopped the arm off and threw them in a pile and set them on fire. As a warning not to have anything to do with the Americans. I'm not trying to scare you guys. I'm not trying to give you nightmares. You just need to understand that the war stuff that y'all see on TV, it's not like that at all. It's much, much worse. And I hate to tell you that story, but it's the truth. It's a documented historical fact. I did not see it myself. I just know of it because we were warned about it.
Well, speaking of other things that we see on TV, knowing that segregation and civil rights was a big issue in the 60s, did you ever experience any civil rights issues in Vietnam among the servicemen?
Not really. When you're in the field and you're in a combat situation, there's no red, white, and blue, and I'm an American, and I'm fighting for my country, or I'm doing this. You fight for the guy next to you. It doesn't matter if he's a black guy, if he's a Mexican guy, if he's an Asian guy. You're all brothers. You depend on one another. The guy on your left looks out for you. You look out for the guy on your left. It was a big shock to me when I came back to this country to see all the hate and segregation here. When you see that it's not the way it was in combat. I'm not saying there were no problems, but in my personal experience, every one of those guys I was with was my brother, and they felt the same way about me. The thing I worried about the most was disappointing my buddy and not being able to take care of him or not do the right thing to make sure that we all got to come back home together.
You touched on this a little bit. Were the South Vietnamese people thankful that America was there, and were they respectful to Americans?
I think so, but again, you have this undercurrent of this threat from the Viet Cong underneath it where if they helped the Americans and somebody ratted them out, or the Vietnamese found out about it, their lives were at risk. So I think the vast majority of them were probably glad that we were there, but you also have accidents too. Like the very famous picture of a little girl, I think she's about 10 years old, and she was in a village when it was struck by planes with napalm, which is jelly gas in it. There's a picture of her going down the road, and her clothes are all